This podcast ponders how we will live in this COVID era.
What's on the horizon?
What should we expect?
Where are the opportunities? We explore the what's next in the next normal.
Taylor, president of Challenge Factory.
The reason every decision we go to make is so difficult is because it's laden with moral hazard. We can't actually judge what's good and bad.
Dave Hardy, president of Hardy Stevenson and Associates.
COVID has really pushed us to think about what healthy cities mean.
Sarah Thorne, president and CEO at Decision Partners.
We've really acknowledged the recognition and the safety and the caring for each other because we've adopted these new behaviors.
Ujwal Arkalgud, chief anthropologist and CEO at MotivBase.
And this is not just because of the pandemic, this is because a lot of us have gained new knowledge.
Welcome back to The Next Normal. I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford.
And so we came off that topic last week about resilience, and we talked about how that really lends itself to looking at the changing meaning of self-care. So I don't know about you, but during the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, self-care for me became so much more important than any other time in my life, I think.
Yeah, I think that time alone, literally and figuratively for all of us, on the one hand could be dangerous because isolation is not necessarily something that we want to dwell on. But at the same time, in my case, both me and your mom kind of looking at life and saying, okay, we've been sitting around in our home offices long enough. It's time for us to get off our asses and be active. Can't get outside. So we became Peloton converts, for example. And now we have put that and actually tied it, embedded it right into our daily schedule. And it becomes an appointment with the bike. And so our physical activity, our exercise, our self-care has become as important as pouring that first cup of coffee and getting to your first meeting during the day. And for me, I didn't realize that until I got on the bike and started, I feel way better and I'm glad I'm getting a break from the other things that are going on. And so that's one anecdotal situation, but it could be anything, whether it was the daily walk with the dog, or we heard a lot about people who bought dogs and went out, that became their self-care. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shifts, or if it does, or if it becomes more of a long-term thing as we become more social. We're starting to get out more, see people, familiar faces again. How self-care is going to play on that. But certainly, it certainly came to the fore, maybe unexpectedly over the last 18 months.
And as somebody who had both a pandemic puppy and a pandemic baby, I can speak to the benefits of each of those, but also how having both of those over the last year has changed the way I prioritize self-care and will going forward. Once we are into the next phase of recovery, I am always now going to prioritize, my at-home spa ritual, my alone time, reading a book, in the mornings before I get out of bed. That was one of my self-care things that I started to do. So I'm really curious to see what our hosts have to say about this idea of self-care, how it's evolving, and how important it was to us getting through the pandemic and into the recovery.
Personally, my own sense of resilience and adaptiveness meant I became a Peloton convert, and I made an appointment with the bike on a regular basis. And that was my own sense of and my own action towards self-care. And Ujwal Arkalgud, we look at that, and I think of that as being not only self-care, but an opportunity to really distract maybe myself from all of the other stuff that was going on around the pandemic. It wasn't COVID all the time. So it just highlighted for me how important it was to focus on well-being and self-care, whether I was doing it consciously or not. It was part of my reflexive response to the pandemic.
Yeah, self-care is one of those topics that is so widely misunderstood in culture, especially in the corporate world. We have so many clients with food and beverage brands and vitamin and mineral brands that all try to use that terminology in order to go to market. but it's really widely misunderstood, primarily because when you actually look at what it means to people, what you'll realize, especially in North America, in the US and Canada, in particular, it's all about understanding oneself better, because self-care is really about understanding the things that trigger a sense of anxiety, stress, mood swings, even depression, whatever it is that I am struggling with, trying to understand not just what triggers it, but what I can do, the different aspects that contribute to it, and what I can do to alleviate some of those feelings, whether it's changing my surroundings, my physical space, how it makes me feel, whether it's thinking about the food I eat and the impact it has on my body and my mind, whether it's thinking about the air I breathe, the activities I do, like you on your Peloton. I think these are important examples. But the funny thing is, this is about taking sort of an overarching holistic view of the things that impact me and learning about myself. And this has certainly accelerated. This desire to learn about ourselves has accelerated through the pandemic. But for the most part, what I find interesting is organizations have not understood this just yet, because they're still trying to sell us products as if it's one solution will fix all your problems. They're still trying to sell us a vitamin supplement for self-care. And it shows the disconnect.
I want to jump into the defense of employers a little bit. And maybe it's because we don't work so much within consumer packaged goods and some of the product-based businesses, but instead work with, a lot of post-secondary institutions, professional service firms, with firms where the core of what they actually have is their people. They're not selling a product, they're selling the knowledge of their people. And what I've seen over the last year is an enormous shift of awareness of what the relationship is and where the employer can actually play a part in helping to understand more holistically what's going on with their staff. So we've seen budgets increase in the area of being able to help teams have more holistic analysis, where they go through a stress assessment that has 9 dimensions that helps them understand, is it a relationship that's causing them anxiety, or is it their personal, physical health and well-being? Is it, what is it that's actually at the heart of some of these things? And give employees the language so that they actually can bring these things up within a corporate setting. We've seen an enormous increase in this type of activity at the employee level. So I think there's a really interesting dichotomy between when these things are being used to market and sell things to us versus some of the trends that we're seeing within workplaces. Maybe it's the workplaces that happen to engage firms like Challenge Factory that are more inclined to look at these things, but where workplaces actually have shifted and started to provide many more tools for employees to not just take a look at these things for themselves, but have language to talk about it with their managers.
Yeah, Lisa, I agree with you. A lot of my clients are utilities, government, and that kind of public sector. They haven't gone as far as what you're suggesting, which is wonderful in terms of how to have that conversation. But what they have done is they've opened up the door to talk about those relationships and to let their employees know that we can be unapologetic about thinking about both our public health and our personal health, self-care, but also our mental health. I was so impressed by one of my clients, a utility, that said, let's have a talk internally about mental health. And it opened up a huge groundswell of discussion and caring among people. So teaching each employee as to how to turn to your neighbor at work and say, how are you doing today? And so on. So I think it's incredibly good to see that happening. I tried it with my own staff. After I go, how's everybody feeling? They go, Dave, we're thrilled that you're actually asking. And we had a conversation about how we're all feeling, because we get depressed, we get distracted and so on, but that's a normal part of living through this pandemic.
I want to pick up on that because I think that one of the parts of self-care and what you've really all been saying to me is it's really made us focus, to your point, Ujwal, about what's really important to us. It's really made us focus on our values. And I can tell you personally, one of the things that I do now is it's really important for me to talk to my sister every day. My sister's in Connecticut. I haven't seen her since a year ago, February. And there are no client meetings that come in before I talk to my sister every day. We have this wonderful opportunity because she's been looking after my great niece, Quinn. And so when she's driving every day, I talk to my sister for about 25 minutes. And if people say to me, well, can you do a call? Then I say, oh, sorry, I've got another commitment. And I'm giving myself permission to do that. You know what? I can honestly tell you 20 years ago, that would not have happened. And is it important to my self-care? You bet. That's the most important thing to me.
The distinction I also wanted to draw was, we do a lot of work with the innovation part of the organization, right? So these are teams charged with coming up with the next solution or the next set of solutions to, in a way, build resiliency for these organizations to survive the innovation that's happening all around them. And the key distinction to be made when you're thinking about designing solutions in the context of self-care is that for human beings, for the consumer, for people, self-care is about tools that help me learn about myself, not tools that solve a problem. And that's the distinction that in particular, I want to clarify. That's the important part for an organization thinking that, hey, I need to be in the self-care space. I have a set of solutions that I think will play in this space. How do I think about it? Well, you think about it as, or ask the question, does your tool help people learn something about themselves, figure something out that's important to them, rather than telling them you have a solution to something?
I think it's going to be so interesting to see what happens in the months to come, because I think a lot of our society was focused on doing things to make you feel better, going and buying a new spring outfit, going on a trip, going and doing things, spending money, buying things, drinking vitamin water that has colors. I don't know what it is, but it'll be so interesting to see what people actually do, having now spent this time for the last 15 or so months, having to actually think about what matters to me. How important is that to me?
So when we talked earlier about resilience and, our willingness and ability to adapt, and now we're diving a little bit more deeply into this whole idea of self-care and well-being. Dave Hardy, I saw a piece this past week that suggested that parks now are becoming part of our active way of developing resilience. And insofar as that was our ability to get outside, enjoy nature, to Ujwal's point, it was actually an opportunity to learn more about myself, whether it was just because I was going for a reflective walk or I was out there with my kids or my grandkids and we were understanding what the gypsy moth really is. And having that conversation at a very deep and observant level, there was real value in that. So, our space, the space that we live in, the space that we recreate in becomes part of this conversation, no?
Yeah, there's a long history in planning in terms of working environmental design into how people live their lives. And we see the usefulness and the importance of that in this pandemic. What we really need to look at is that how do we use the parks? How do we preserve them? And my concern is that sometimes we are having, like, as a planner, I'm seeing a really worshiping density. And sometimes those non-dense parks, rural areas are so therapeutic to us and have to be, continue to be so, in terms of other pressures that we have to deal with in cities.
Yeah, I've heard where doctors are actually prescribing walks in the wilderness. Lisa, you got to wonder whether or not that's going to be an added benefit in the workplace. Here's a prescription for a hike.
So, I think we're already seeing evolutions of that. Workplaces have had gyms, and the major workplaces have had gyms or gym memberships or different types of physical health benefits that they provide. I think one of the things that's really interesting that's happened is the shift in how we talk about mental health. Dave mentioned mental health earlier on in this episode. And what I really like is I like the shift where we're now talking about the dichotomy between mental wellness and mental illness, that it's like a spectrum and that it's not just a single thing. We either have mental health or we don't, but that we fall on this spectrum at any point in time between mental wellness and mental illness, and all of the components that go into what gives us the fortitude and the resilience to be able to be mentally healthy, mentally well. And that has to do with how we think about ourselves. What we, to Ujwal's point earlier, do we know what we need? And do we know how to know what we need? Those are all learning processes that we have to go through. It's very meta, but it's very important that we really think that through. And then in the workplace, if you want a healthy workforce, that includes them being mentally healthy and have mental wellness as well. And that includes them having a real strong sense that their work has meaning and purpose, that it relates to the work of the other people that they're working with. This isn't just about activities like taking a walk or eating healthier. There's connection and relationship that also goes into what does it mean for us to take care of ourselves. And knowing what we want from our work and where we're heading is an enormous part of mental health. And I'll just mention really quickly, there's been studies that have been done that have shown that when teenagers in high school are given significant opportunities to do good career exploration where they can see where their interests connect with their community, the demand on social workers within those schools goes down. So that's true for adults as well. If you know how you connect with the community around you and how your talents really relate to what's needed around you, it gives you much more agency to be able to take control of some of the other areas of self-care that you also need to be focusing on.
I would totally agree. And I want to pick up on that because I think it's a really important point, reflecting on our conversation about adaptation and resilience and community resilience. Just understanding who's in your community and acknowledging what they do, what their role is. I remember being in my little grocery store. I haven't been in a big grocery store for a year and a half. Being in my little grocery store and just getting to know the people at the cash personally and thanking them for the job that they're doing. Those are the people that are looking after us. I have a neighbor who puts out a bucket of little treats and bottled water for delivery people. We rely on those delivery people. They're the ones that, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, those were the people that were bringing us food and anything that we ordered. Now they're part of the fabric of our community. And just being able to acknowledge people and reach out to them, I found it's really important to ask people, how are you doing today? I think it's a better question and it's a more honest question than how are you? Just kind of a throwaway. Or, how are you today? Or have a good day. But how are you doing today? Because one of the things that certainly I've experienced, I expect you all have too, is that my friends, my family, my colleagues, going through this pandemic, it's been different people have had different days. Some days are tougher than others to get through. And sometimes for really no, apparent reason, there's just days that are tougher than others. And I think that just taking the time to ask people, how are you doing today? Is so powerful. And it's such an important connection to where you are and who you're with.
Sarah, where I have a lot of fun is my wife takes me for a daily walk around the block. But now with the pandemic, I see what used to be strangers going for their walks as well. And I'm kind of an out person. So I say, how are you? They go, are you talking to me? What's wrong? It's like, no, I'm talking to you because you're my neighbor and I see you every day. So I think I should be talking to you. Oh, I'm doing fine. How are you doing? It's kind of breaking down that a sense of relationships with other people and building that community, which is so important.
I had the funniest experience I'll share with you guys. About 2-3 months into the pandemic last year, all of the people where I am who are out walking their dogs, everybody knows everything about everybody's dog, the dog's name, everything about the dog. And what happened, and it happened to be about 3 times in about 2 days, people said, I know your dog's name, Birdie. I don't know your name. And it's important I know your name now. And now I have all these friends and we all know each other's name. And of course, we still know everything about everybody's dogs.
I'll share an example of how we've been able to do that remotely, even within the workplace. So within my own team at Challenge Factory, we have people that work all over the country. Some have joined us during the pandemic. We've never met we've never actually met in person. But, you know, one of the things that was really important, especially with team members that live alone, that went through the early parts of the pandemic really isolated, was to make sure that they knew that there was connections and that there was ways to talk about these things at work, because we spend so much time at work that's actually a significant part of how we can do this, not just on the walks in our free time, but all the way through our day. So we started a process where every other week we meet on Friday afternoon and we have what's called a noticing circle. And instead of asking, how are you feeling or how are you doing, which some people may find easy to answer or hard to answer, all that I ask of my team is, what are you noticing? And I ask them just to report back, what are they noticing, whether that's something in their own personal life or with their family? What are they noticing in the media and the stories that are being covered, in the kinds of work that we're doing and the feedback we're getting from clients? Whatever level they want to answer the question on, we enter the discussion by just saying, what are you noticing? And we've had enormously vulnerable conversations among this team that really, in the pre-pandemic days, we would have said are strangers because we've never met face to face. They don't know each other all that well necessarily. We've really become very tight simply because we've taken the time and the space to notice what's happening around us and to share that with each other. And we publish the results of those noticing circles and we can track over time. It's almost like a timeline of the key topics of the pandemic that have happened over the course of the time horizon.
That's pretty cool. We were doing the same thing in my company, but around gratitude and having everybody talk about what they were most grateful for in the first year. It was a really interesting way to start the conversation.
Well, this leads us nicely into where we want to take this conversation, because I think we're kind of gone through the resilience phase and talked a lot about that. We really need to talk about this, the effort around recovery. And I know, Lisa, you and your team are particularly focused on that. And the question is, you know, are we recovery ready? You guys have, you've got an event and a whole host of things that are coming up. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So in August, we have a summit that's being led for mid-size leaders in companies that are mid-size that may not have significant internal bench strength to be able to think through, how do you capitalize on all the opportunity that's about to happen while recognizing your teams are probably pretty tired. And so how do you get out ahead of what's about to happen? So you don't just aim for the date. You don't just look to kind of get yourself back open, but you actually have a really significant recovery plan that you can go into the fall with. And it looks at leadership, it looks at culture, it looks at strategy, and it looks at measurement. What's happened? What do you need to be focused on now? And what's the plan going forward? So there's lots more information about that at recoveryready.ca. And it's a great group of people that are coming together for some really solid action planning.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that the focus is on planning, because I think one episode here, we started off by saying there was no plan, and here's where we find ourselves. All right, we'll leave it there. But between now and the next time you listen, we're going to put some thought into what is the recovery plan? What does that look like? And the actual innovation that we're going to have around public policy to make some of this really take shape and form. Yeah, that was a good conversation. And I think it's an important thing to just, breathe, and take that moment to be aware. And the last couple of episodes have really been focused on awareness and so many levels, self-awareness. And I should say, I didn't mention this off the top of the show, but part of my self-care was sitting in the barber chair getting a haircut. So small as that might have been.
I have found I'm also much more conscious of asking people now that not only how are you doing, but how are you doing today? How are you doing today in this moment? And it's self-care and also awareness of the other that is what's going to bridge this isolation gap where we have felt so alone and so cut off. But as soon as you kind of step out and say, how are you doing today? That social fabric really starts to solidify again, right? Like Dave talking about his wife taking him for a walk, and then all of a sudden the neighbors who they had never really talked to before are no longer strangers. They're friends, they're familiar faces, right? Yeah. The silver lining here is that when we indulge in self-care, or this is what I've learned, when we advocate for our own self-care, we actually become better human beings.
I use that phrase, how are you now? And I always get the letter Kenny response, but at least it makes that kind of social engagement where you can get into it. And people will say, well, what do you mean, how am I now? No other time matters. Right now is what matters. How are you right now? And so it has never been more obvious than it has been during this COVID period.
Yeah, I do that with my kids all the time, right? Like I'll ask my 4-year-old, how are you feeling right now? And kids are really great at answering that question, but adults not so much. But I think we have gotten better at becoming aware of where we are in this moment and saying, you know what, I'm having a tough moment right now. I'm having a great moment right now. And that's just part of resiliency and building our communities back up. The Next Normal is sponsored by Challenge Factory, shaping the future of work.
By Decision Partners. Our world is a better place when we make better decisions.
By MotivBase, decoding implicit meaning behind what people talk about.
And by Hardy Stevenson and Associates, planning the cities of the future.
Comments, questions, or ideas for our hosts? Feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com.
This series is produced for the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.